But to start us off, I want to tell you about my buddy Nate. My buddy Nate, he is an electrician at a big power plant. And every year they have what is called a shutdown. And this is when they shut down all of the operations of the plant for an unspecified amount of time. And what they do is they put new machines in, or they fix old machines, or they do upgrades. This is the time where they do those things that they could only do when the plant is shut down. And this is, as the electrician, this is a very, very busy time of the year for my buddy Nate. And so each year when the shutdown happens, he pretty much disappears for a month or so. And let me tell you, he dreads this time of year. He has to work every single day. He is unable to take any time off, no vacation, no doctor's appointments, not allowed to leave early, none of that. The shifts are very long. To be honest, he's lucky if he gets to go home and catch a few hours of sleep. They've been known to stay there during this period of shutdown. And so these shutdowns, they're usually somewhere around 2 weeks to a month long, but he never knows how long exactly it's going to last. And so, as you can imagine, during this time, he gets very, very little time with his wife and his 4 young children. He doesn't have the time or the energy to do any of the stuff that needs to be done around his house. It's basically he has to put his whole life on pause for this shutdown, this period of time. His only hope and his only solace really is that he knows at some point the shutdown will end and then life will go back to normal. And as I said, he never knows quite when that will be. One time, this yearly shutdown, it involved a very large project of which Nate, as the electrician, was crucial to its operation and its installation. And so that shutdown lasted 5 months. So literally, this is 5 months of no family, no sleep. He didn't see the light of day for 5 months. All he saw for 5 months was the dark, dingy power plant and the stinky dudes that he works with. And that was his life. And it was brutal for him. And so as I think about Nate sometimes, and I've known him for a while, and every year this would come around, and he'd go, it's shutdown time in 2 weeks. And it was like there was a calendar, like a bad calendar, counting down the days. But as I think of Nate, in that 5 months, it kind of reminds me a lot of Noah and his time in the ark. God had sent a flood to judge wicked humanity. That's what we looked at last week. But God had graciously shut Noah and his family and the animals in the safety of the ark. However, when we think about it, Noah, he didn't have all the info. He didn't have a lot of the info. He never knew when they were going to leave that ark. Have you ever thought about that? He never knew when this was going to be all over. Day after day, he was just continuing to care for the animals. Day after day, he was just doing the work that needed to be done inside the ark. There was probably very little light. I imagine that it stunk to high heavens with all those animals in there. He was confined with the same 7 people that whole time. Now, granted, they were family members, but it's still the same 7 people. It's probably maybe worse that they were family members. He was just adrift, floating on the floodwaters. He never knew when it would all end and they could just get off the ark and begin to live again. He never knew. Well, as we continue to look at the flood this morning, guess what? We get to exit the ark. Noah comes out of the ark. And last week, we focused on Noah's faithfulness. Noah was faithful in doing what God had commanded, and he received mercy from God for being faithfully obedient, and he was delivered from the flood. Well, today, we're going to shift that a little bit, and we're going to focus on God's faithfulness. So God's faithfulness is what's before us today. Specifically, we're going to consider this morning that God is faithful to remember, that God and his faithfulness are to be worshiped, and that God's faithfulness is our great blessing. And so if you take those points that are on the back of your bulletin and you mix-mash them together, what you come away with for our big idea, our takeaway today, is that God's faithfulness is our great blessing, and he is deserving of our worship. So that's what I want us to leave here with today. So here we are. Noah, he's floating along. He is holed up in the ark. He's having faith in God, but he's unsure how long this is all going to last. How long is this going to last? But then in verse 1, if you look at verse 1, it says, "But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark." God remembered. Those are wonderful words. And don't think of that as if God has forgotten that the ark was adrift on this flood and that Noah and his family and all these animals were in there. As humans, we have the ability to forget, don't we? I mean, it's nearly a daily occurrence where I walk into a room to get something or to do something, and then I walk into that room and I go, I have no idea what I came in here for. And then it's hours later where lightning kind of strikes my little pea brain and I go, that's what I was going to do. But then it's too late, right? It's too late at that point. God doesn't forget. He's incapable of forgetting. So don't look at this as if God is suddenly remembering Noah. That word for remembrance, it's most often used in reference to God being thoughtful or mindful of a person or a situation. When God remembers, it usually means that God is going to act in accordance to one of his covenant promises. So almost always when God remembers someone, it's considering a person and considering their situation and then acting on their behalf. When God remembers, it's God being faithful to a person and a promise. Let me give you some examples. When God remembers, it's him being faithful to a person and a promise. Let me give you some examples. We're told that God remembers Abraham in Genesis 19. And then what we see God doing, because that's the chapter of Sodom and Gomorrah, is he rescues Abraham's nephew Lot. We're told that God remembers Rachel. And what he consequently does is opens her barren womb, and she has a son named Joseph. We're told that at one point that God remembered his people Israel in Egypt, and subsequently they are freed from enslavement. So God has not forgotten Noah here. What is meant that is God is going to act. He's going to do something in Noah's situation in order to fulfill what he had promised Noah. And what he had promised Noah was that him and his wife and his sons and his wife's sons and all of these animals, that they would be spared the flood judgment. And so God's getting ready to act on that promise. That's what it means that God remembered. So what did God do? Well, if you see here, starting in the rest of verse 1 through verse 4, first, God used a wind to blow over the earth. And we said previously that the flood, remember, I said it was sort of like a decreation, where he was going to wipe it all out and then he was going to recreate. He was going to build anew. And we see the beginnings of that new creation right here. Remember when we went through the creation account in Genesis 1, we read this. And remember that at this time, the earth was still covered in water in the creation account. And this is what we read. Genesis 1:2. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. That was the creation account, right? This is really cool. The word for wind in our verse that God caused to blow over the waters is the same word for spirit here. And so just as in original creation, God's Spirit is hovering over and moving over the face of the waters. Can you see that picture? It's the same. It says that God causes the fountains and the rains to cease. So the flood, the resources of the flood, the sources, they've stopped. And the waters, they begin receding from the earth here. I've included, if you look at your little bulletin on the back side, I've included what I think is the best timeline of the chronology of the flood. So the time from when the rain started to the time when the waters abated was 150 days. And we read that exactly 5 months to the day from when the flood began, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Now, some people argue about where this, we have a Mount Ararat, but some people don't think that's the Mount Ararat. It was a mountain range, so they're not sure exactly where. But I believe it was probably somewhere in Turkey, what's modern day Turkey, or northern Armenia. And so we see that in the 10th month, the tops of the mountains could be seen. So it's the ark runs aground, and then a little while later, in the 10th month, the tops of the mountains begin to become visible. And then as we continue on with the timing here, some birds enter into the picture for some strange reason. 40 days after the mountaintops became visible, Noah, he pops the top to the ark, and he goes out on the deck, and he lets a raven loose. Why a raven? I don't know. If you're looking for an answer, I don't know. I don't know. Some say it was because the raven was an unclean bird. And so it wouldn't be useful for eating or for offering as a sacrifice. And so therefore it was kind of expendable. And so he just lets the raven loose. Well, here's the thing. Ravens are scavengers. We see that all the time around here, right? I see them eating roadkill all the time. And so what happened here, and I don't want to be graphic again, but there's bodies and flesh floating on the waters. And so what this raven did was he just landed on some of this flesh and began to eat. And he never returned. Okay? Well, Noah, he gets wise, and so he sends out a dove. But there wasn't any place for it to land, we're told. And so it came back. And then he waited for 7 days and sent out the dove again. And this time the dove returned, but this time with a little ray of hope, a freshly plucked olive leaf in its mouth. So this would have been a sign to Noah that at least in part the waters have subsided enough for some vegetation to sprout up. And so he waits another 7 days, and he sends out the dove again. And then when it didn't return, he then knew that the waters had completely receded from the earth because the dove was able to land somewhere. And then as we move on to verses 13 through 19, we read that the waters were dried up from the earth on the first day of the first month of the 601st year of Noah's life. The first day of the first month. That's New Year's. What a way to celebrate New Year's. The earth is finally dry. But it wasn't until the 27th day of the second month that God commanded Noah and his family to exit the ark and bring all the animals with them. So imagine that. You know the earth is dry, but you're still on the ark. But God hasn't commanded you to leave the ark yet. And so you sit there and you wait. And you wait. It was about 56 or 57 days that he waited for God. And then finally God commanded him to leave the ark. And we might question, well, what's up with that? I would have been out of there, right? As soon as I knew it was dry, I would have skipped off. But this is who Noah is. We looked at that last week, right? Noah is a faithful man. He's faithfully obedient to God, and he is waiting upon God to tell him to leave the ark. He's not taking the initiative himself. He's waiting upon God. And so what we have is we started off in verse 1 with God remembering Noah. God had established a covenant with Noah that he and his family and these animals, that they would have been spared the judgment of the flood. And here God has fulfilled and been faithful to that promise. We need to see that. God had shut them in, and he has quite literally brought them through the storm, exactly as he said that he would. And what I want us to see is that this is the faithfulness of God. God is faithful to remember. Now, once again, that means that God is faithful to act toward and on behalf of those to whom he has made covenant promises. To remember, our God is a loving and faithful God who never forgets those that are his. Never. He is always mindful of those that he has chosen. He always knows those who he has set his eyes upon. So I find a lot of encouragement in this verse from Deuteronomy 7, verse 9. It says, listen to this. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. He is a faithful God. Do you believe that this morning? As limited and finite humans, we are prone to let others down. We have all been let down, and we have all let down others. We have all made promises that we didn't keep. Sometimes we don't keep promises because we don't have the resources or the ability to keep them, money or time. Sometimes an obstacle arises where we can't fulfill our promises. But that's not so with God. Have you ever thought about that? He is the sovereign Almighty. He is the God of the universe. Every single resource is at his fingertips. There is no obstacle that could ever stand in his way. Ever. It's him who quite literally here controls the floodwaters. And he will always be faithful to remember his promises and to act accordingly. Always. Remember, again, that Noah had no idea how long he was going to be on this ark. No idea. Even though he was told by God to build it and to enter into it, there must have been a little bit of uncertainty. Don't you think? With Noah, even with how faithful he is, he had to wonder, how long is this going to take? What's it all going to look like when it's all over? When it is over, how are we going to pick up the pieces and begin to live again? There would be questions, there would be uncertainty, yet God was mindful of Noah. And in his own perfect timing and according to his own perfect will, he acted on his behalf. So as we think about that for us, it's most likely that in your life you have had seasons where you were tossed about on the storm waters, wondering when it would all end. If you've lived any amount of time, you've all been in situations where you were uncertain where you would be when you finally landed. And truth be told, I know everybody in here. And so I know some of your situations, and I know that you're going through those situations right now, today. However, here is the great blessing. If you, like Noah, walk with God, you not only know God, but more importantly, you are known by God. And God remembers those who are his. God is faithful to his children. You must believe that this morning. The missionary Hudson Taylor, he says this: all God's giants have been weak men and women who have gotten hold of God's faithfulness. There's a lot of truth there. We need to grasp the faithfulness of God, because it's only then when weak men and women like ourselves will be able to do big things for God and for his kingdom. God is faithful to remember. I know that there are life situations out here right now. I am in them. Some of you are in them. And all we can do is cling to his faithfulness. We turn in all types of different directions, but there's only one direction that we need to go. That's to grab onto him, his love and his faithfulness. Let his faithfulness, not somebody else's, be the anchor of your soul. We have to know that, and we have to do that. Noah is remembered by God, and he's safely delivered from the judgment. And the very first thing, I love this, the very first thing that we read that he does when his feet touch dry land is he offers up worship to God. It's the very first thing he does. Verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Last week, we talked about briefly when God had given the instructions to bring all these different animals aboard, we looked at the fact that he commanded that 7 pairs, some female and male pairs of each clean animal be brought, 1 pair of each unclean animal, and 7 pairs of birds. And we wondered, why 7 pairs of clean animals and why 7 pairs of birds? And we said there, because they would be used for sacrifice, for offerings. And here we are. That's exactly what Noah does. He takes some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird, and he sacrifices them. He offers them up as a burnt offering to the Lord, an act of worship, an act of thanksgiving. Many of us were probably at least somewhat familiar with the sacrificial system of Moses. But realize this is hundreds of years before Moses. And that's because the idea of sacrifices and offerings, they didn't begin with Moses. Remember, we've seen it already. Cain and Abel, they brought sacrifices to the Lord. Remember, Cain's was rejected, Abel's was accepted. And now we see Noah, he offers up a sacrifice. The sacrificial system that we get to at the time of Noah, it has lots of different meanings and lots of different purposes. But here, before that time, I believe that these sacrifices, these offerings at the time of Noah, they were an act of worship to celebrate and to declare and to proclaim the goodness and faithfulness of God. Noah's worship here, it's a declaration of his gratitude and his thankfulness for God's provision and for his faithfulness to him. That's what this is. Imagine Noah's sense of relief. Have you ever thought about that? Imagine his sense of relief, 370 days aboard the ark, when he finally gets to step off of that ark. Who here has been on a cruise before? Anybody been on a cruise? Listen, I love cruises, primarily because I love food, and they got a lot of food. And they have everything that you could ever need or want on that cruise. And generally, they're really comfortable. But correct me if I'm wrong, I always enjoyed the excursion days when you finally docked somewhere, because just to walk outside and to feel the solid ground under your feet, I enjoyed that. And so I have to think here that Noah sprinted off of that ark. If I was him, I would have been taking deep breaths of fresh air. I would have picked up the dirt and let it just flow through my fingers. And maybe Noah did do some of those things, but you know what? The very first thing that we see him doing, the very first thing we do, is worshiping God. For 370 days, Noah has been on this journey, and as it comes to an end, as it comes to a close, he reflects on God's faithfulness and worships and praises God. And we have to understand this too, that Noah's not just worshiping some God in general. This isn't some distant or nebulous God. If you look there at the text, you see that the offering was made to the Lord. The Lord is in all caps, which means that this is Yahweh, the covenantal, personal God. Not just some God, this is to Yahweh. Now, of course, we understand that there is only one God. But Noah's sacrifice here, it is a relational and personal offering because it is delivered up to the God that he walked with. It's made to the God that gave Noah mercy and favor. This is the God that established a covenant with Noah and then delivered him from the judgment. And God and his faithfulness are to be worshipped. So as we think of that, how have you seen God's faithfulness in your life? Has God ever brought you through a storm and placed your feet on solid ground? Have you experienced God moving and acting on your behalf? And I'm sure you have, because just as certain as I am that sometimes storms will come, I'm equally as certain that storms have passed. And that is because of God's faithfulness. But here's the real question. Because of God's faithfulness to you, have you worshiped him? God is worthy of our devotion and our worship simply by the simple fact of who he is. But when we add to that, when we consider his providential hand in our lives, the way he moves through the thread of our lives for our good, as a demonstration of his faithfulness, does that lead you with a heart overcome with joy and gratitude and love? Does that lead to worship? It should. It should. And worship, understand, can take a lot of different forms. But all worship is founded and grounded in adoration, awe, praise, and devotion to a faithful God. Contemplating, when we think about God's faithfulness, it should be one of the many, but one of the springboards that leads us to worship. And you don't need to, or should you, wait until something really big happens to worship God for his faithfulness. We should get into the habit of worshiping God even in what we might consider the routine or mundane acts of his faithfulness. The sun shining, food in our fridge, whatever it may be, they're all worthy of God's faithfulness because they all come from him. God has promised us many things, and he is continually being faithful to those promises as he works in your life. And I need you to believe that. I need to believe that. God and his faithfulness are to be worshiped. All right, as we move into the last couple verses of chapter 8 and then the first 17 verses of chapter 9, we have here what comes to be known as the Noahic covenant. And as we look at this, I want us to see that God's faithfulness, the ways in which he is faithful to us, they are for our good. They are our great blessing. So look with me first at verses 21 through 22. It says, "And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature, as I have done. While the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." So Noah, he offers up this sacrifice of worship, and it's pleasing to the Lord. And he makes a promise that will become more defined here shortly. And this promise is that even though man's heart is still evil, and it's evil from his youth, he will never again curse the ground, that he will never again strike down every living thing. You see, the flood of judgment, it didn't wipe out man's sin problem. Next week, we will see that Noah himself falls into sin. Sin remains. And therefore, when we think about that, if sin remains, there could be this question in the mind of man. If God wiped out everybody because of their sin by a flood, what is stopping him from doing it again? And God makes this promise here. He says, never again will I curse the ground in that way. Never again will I strike down every living thing. Just to be clear, that promise doesn't mean that there will never be another flood or that there won't be any more natural disasters ever. That promise doesn't mean that nobody will ever die in a flood or die from a natural disaster. What that promise means is that while those things will still happen and people will still die, that it will be localized. It won't be a worldwide flood. God promises in verse 22 that while the earth remains, even though man is still evil, he will be faithful to bring about some sort of stability and continuity upon the earth. There will be times and there will be seasons. He's going to provide. While anomalies will happen, God will sovereignly direct a general order of nature. And as we think about this promise, that is God's faithfulness to his creation. And that is our good. It's our great blessing. The voice is shot now. Okay, so let's look at verses 1 through 7. "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the flesh of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat the flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image, and you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it. As we hear this, or as we listen to this, do you hear an echo of the creation account in there? Some of the same phrases. Think back to the creation account in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. The beginning and the end of this section here, verse 1 and verse 7, they both repeat that creation mandate that we talked about in the original act of creation. God had originally blessed Adam and Eve, and he had given them the creation mandate. Remember, to be fruitful and multiply. That's what he told them to do. Well, now God blesses Noah and his sons, and he commands them the very same thing, be fruitful and multiply. In the creation mandate, if you remember, Adam and Eve, they were given dominion over all of creation. And here, Noah and his sons are as well. God tells them that the fear of them, the dread of them, will be upon every animal, and that he has given everything to them. Just as God had given Adam and Eve the plants for food, God now even extends that and gives to Noah and his family animals to eat. So real quick, what we see here is in this recreation that's happening is that Noah is a type of Adam. The same blessings, the same instructions are given to each one. And we're going to see that each of them, Adam and Noah, fall into sin. The life of Adam, it's reflected in the life of Noah. And Noah is meant to point us to Jesus, who Scripture calls the second Adam. The second Adam. And the difference is that Jesus comes and doesn't fall into sin. Perfect obedience. So as God gives them permission to eat meat here, the only prohibition that they have is that they're not to eat the animals with its blood. Moses is writing this, when you think about it, he's writing this at a time when pagan practices included sacrificing animals and oftentimes drinking the blood. They believe that if you drink an animal's blood, that the power and the attributes of the animal would somehow be transferred over to them. And he's saying, hey, Noah, sons of Noah, don't do that. And God, what he's really doing here is he's putting forth an ethic of the sanctity of life. All life, but especially the life of man. Animals are to be eaten. He gives permission to eat animals here. But there is an order and there's a decency to it. Think about it. In the wild, when an animal eats another animal, they go up and they tear the flesh and the blood and take it all down together. Man's not to do it that way. There's an order, there's a decency to it. But more importantly, the sanctity of life, it's most significant in man himself. You see there, it says, for the shedding of blood, a life is required. For the shedding of blood, a life is required. If an animal kills a man, then that animal must be killed. And when we get to the time of Moses, there's some specific laws that are put in place to make sure that that happens. But on top of that, this is also a requirement of capital punishment. If a man kills another man, his life is required of him. Blood for blood. The reason that there is this sanctity of life here, the reason it's given, is at the end of verse 7. It says, for God made man in his own image. We've talked previously about the image of God. We've gone over it quite a few times, and we talked about what it means, but also the fact that with sin, that image has become deformed and fractured and marred. However, we need to see here that the image still remains. It still remains, even though it's not as it should be. Yet even so, because man is created in the image of God, the life of all men and women, not just some, the life of all men and women has value and worth. And once again, if you allow yourself to think about it, this is the faithfulness of God toward his creation. And this is for our good blessing. Our lives, they have value and worth. All right, these last verses here, they are the nuts and the bolts of the Noahic covenant. It says, then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. This is the second use of that word covenant in the Bible. The first, if you remember, was last week when God established that covenant with Noah to deliver him and his family from the judgment of the flood. And I don't necessarily think that this is actually a second covenant. I think this is part of that same covenant. This is just a fuller exposition of that covenant, if that makes sense. Notice it says that the covenant is established with you and your offspring after you. He's speaking to Noah, but he's saying this is for all of your offspring. And so that would be for all of humanity. And then it extends to every living creature that is with you. This is actually a promise. While we call it the Noahic covenant, it's actually a promise to all living creatures. And what is the promise? God says that he will never again send a flood to wipe out all flesh and to destroy the earth. And this is just a continuation of what we read earlier about God providing stability and continuity and consistency in the natural world. There will never be another flood like the Great Flood. Never. Now, when it comes to biblical covenants, we have what are called conditional and unconditional covenants. In a conditional covenant, God promises to do something if the other party promises to do something alongside of him. So it's kind of like God says, I will do this if you do that. Well, this covenant here with Noah, it's an unconditional covenant. There is no if. There is no conditions that need to be met. This is just a promise from God. And all biblical covenants have a sign as well. We'll see this when you look through Scripture, you'll see it. The sign of the Abrahamic covenant that comes up, it's going to be circumcision. The sign of the Mosaic covenant, when it comes about, is going to be the Sabbath. And we read here that the sign of this covenant is a rainbow. A rainbow. God says that when the clouds come, that there's no need for alarm. Don't freak out, because when you see the rainbow, you'll remember, and I will remember, that I will not send a flood to wipe out every living thing again. This is the promise of God. God says this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth, a rainbow. Now, I don't need to tell you that there are certain groups that have kind of commandeered the rainbow as their own symbol and sign, but just understand that that's not what it means. And that's not what it means at all. What it means is it's God's faithfulness. It's a sign of God's faithfulness towards his creation. And ultimately, God's faithfulness is always, brothers and sisters, always our good. It's always for our great blessing. We are the beneficiaries of his faithfulness. God's faithfulness is who God is. And God's faithfulness, it always results in our good. Always. And that's the point this morning, that God's faithfulness is our great blessing, and he is deserving of our worship. That's our big takeaway today, as we see God faithful to fulfill his promise to Noah by delivering him from the flood. God's faithfulness causes Noah to be overcome with gratitude and thankfulness, causing him to worship. And finally, we see that God is continuing to be faithful to his creation with the blessing of a covenant here. And so as we leave this morning, I want to just end with this. I want to take just a moment to consider God's faithfulness toward us by way of his Son. After all, understand this, all covenants and all promises point to and find their fulfillment in the Son, Jesus Christ. He is the second Adam. He is the better Noah. If you are united to Jesus by faith this morning, you have to know this, that you are in a covenant relationship with God. You are in the new covenant. That's what we call it. Purchased and inaugurated by the blood of Christ. And in the new covenant, you have many promises. You have been promised that your sins are no more, that you have the righteousness of Christ. And because of that you are now reconciled to God. You are no longer called an enemy, but you are called sons and daughters of God. In the new covenant, you receive all the spiritual blessings in the heavenly places. We're told there the promise that we have an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading. This inheritance is sealed by the Spirit of God in you. God has promised that he will never leave you. He will never forsake you. You have the promise that you will be spared the judgment and that Christ is coming again to receive you to him. And that you will live forever in eternal glory. That's just some of them. Promise upon promise upon promise upon promise. Brothers and sisters, God is faithful to remember his promises. He knows you, and he will act on your behalf according to all that he has promised. This faithfulness towards us, that's our great blessing. It should be what encourages us. It should be what strengthens us. It should be what assures us, and it should be what emboldens us. It should be what moves us, and it should be what grows us. God's faithfulness. And so as we leave here this morning thinking of God's great faithfulness toward us that is demonstrated in Noah and perfected in Jesus Christ, I pray that we would leave here overwhelmed with joy and gratitude, that our hearts, they would burst forth in worship to this faithful God who knows us and who loves us. Worship him in the big things. Worship him in the small things. But above all things, may he receive all glory and praise and honor and worship. Amen.